welcome to your Access Point to Washington. I'm Aisha Tanseem. Sectarian violence in Pakistan is not a new phenomenon, but the recent rise in it, particularly the killings in the Hazara community that pushed them so far to the edge that they refused to bury their dead, have made everyone stop and think. Today, we'll explore the issue of sectarian violence, particularly the Shia-Sunni violence in Pakistan, its history, its background, its causes, and possible solutions. Joining us in our discussion in our London studios is Dr. Gareth Price, the Senior Research Fellow of the Asia Program at Chatham House. From Oxford, UK, we are joined by Dr. Ishtiaq Ahmed, the Quaid-e-Azam Fellow at the University of Oxford. Gentlemen, welcome to the show. Let me start with you, Dr. Ahmed. Let's start from the beginning. Is it accurate to say that sectarian violence started in a big way during General Zia-ul Haq's time, or are the roots go even deeper than that?
Well, it began during Zia-ul Haq's time because his regime, Zia-ul Haq, ruled for 11 years. And he prolonged his rule by actually creating and expanding a variety of fissures in the society, including sectarian divisions. But having said that, I think if you want to trace the roots of this problem, we can go back to the 1940s when, although the country was created, as Jinnah, the founder, made it clear right in the beginning, it was created as on secular foundations, but within few years after his death, an objectives resolution was passed, and which became a part of successive constitution, handing over sovereignty to Almighty Allah, which gave rise to this finality of the Prophet Khatm-e-Nabuwwat movement, whose first militant expression was to target the Ahmadiyya minority back in the 1950s. And subsequently, we have seen this minority problem in Pakistan actually worsening with every passing decade. In the 1970s, consciously, the state of Pakistan chose to align itself with Saudi Arabia. And then post-1979 Iranian Revolution, we had this Saudi-Iranian rivalry extending its tentacles to Pakistani situation, and which matches with Zia-ul Haq's preferences.
So, Dr. Ahmed, what you're suggesting is that the roots go back all the way to the beginning, but Zia-ul Haq's time is when the government officially kind of aligned itself with Saudi Arabia, and some people suggest that there was a proxy war in Pakistan for influence between Iran and Saudi Arabia. Dr. Gareth Price, I want to bring you in at that time. Around that time, two things were happening simultaneously. I want you to talk a little bit about how that might have influenced the situation. We saw the Iranian Revolution in 1979, and at the same time, the Taliban, which are essentially Sunni and from a very orthodox Sunni sect, were being funded by Saudi Arabia, by the US, by a lot of different parties to go fight Russia. So do you think that that may have had a big impact on the situation?
Pakistani identity and the sense that Pakistan's an Islamic country, and during Zia-ul Haq's time, the idea that that type of Islam was Sunni rather than Shia Islam. And to add to the kind of historical context, I mean, in 1971 you saw the secession of what became Bangladesh from Pakistan, which kind of reinforced this idea that Pakistan hadn't stated its identity enough and therefore needed more vociferously to be Islamic. And then in the context of the Iranian Revolution of '79, that started to empower the Shia communities, and yet, as you say, and the various Taliban-linked groups that were fighting, or Mujahideen that were fighting the Soviet Union, were primarily Sunni.
Well, let's come to the present. So we've talked a little bit about history, we've talked a little bit about background. We know that there were times in the 80s when sectarian violence was really bad, but then it subsided, and then it resurged again post 9/11 by some accounts. If you go to the South Asia Terrorism Portal, 2007 onwards been really bad. So Dr. Ahmed, let's talk about what were the causes of sectarian violence becoming a bigger issue in the last 5 to 7 years.
Well, obviously, Pakistan joining this war on terror led to a blowback, uh, partly because of its own strategic depth policies of the 1990s, in which it supported the Taliban and other regressive radical Islamic elements in Afghanistan and the region, and partly because there was some kind of a natural reaction. If you support the US in Afghanistan, and naturally, if you were aligning with these very forces before, there will be a reaction. But sectarianism or sectarian violence in Pakistan actually predates the events of 9/11. It was occurring, as we just heard the other speaker, back in the 1980s. It continued in the 1990s. But in the 1990s, we saw this democratic transition, and the various civilian governments actually set up special courts, anti-terrorism courts, and there was quite a tough policy and a little bit of zero tolerance against groups engaged in sectarian violence. That is why it subsided. But since sectarian groups, especially the Sunni organization, Sipah-e-Sahaba Pakistan, and its militant wing, Lashkar-e-Jhangvi, they are associated with Tehreek-e-Taliban Pakistan, with Al-Qaeda, and with a whole lot of criminal, religious, radical organizations inside Pakistan and outside Pakistan, an international connection, which is why we have seen an old violent trend in Pakistani society, religiously motivated, actually picking up momentum in the last 5 years or so.
Okay, Dr. Gareth Price, do you want to add to that?
No, I think, it's worth remembering one of the first times Osama bin Laden came into view was in attacks on Shias in Gilgit in Pakistan in the late 80s. So a lot of these Islamist groups, that became Al-Qaeda and anti-Western groups had their origins in attacking Shias.
And Dr. Price, add to that, could it also have a pragmatic link, because they needed routes to Quram, and some people have suggested that they also did that because they needed routes to Quram, which are controlled by Shia communities, and when Taliban and Al-Qaeda wanted to go back and forth between Afghanistan, they also wanted to destroy those links. Would you agree to that?
Yeah, I think there are many elements to this, and I think, the attacks on Shias, you can fit them in within a sort of wider range of attacks on in an arc stretching from Afghanistan through to Kashmir, and at the moment, a lot of the focus of these groups appears to be on Shias within Pakistan. We've also got to say it's a time of political flux in Pakistan, that these attacks have the potential to be more damaging now than maybe at other times. There are elections due. There's changes of the Chief of Army Staff. There's a lot of change coming up in Pakistan, and so this is a time with the ability to disrupt activities in Pakistan, as well, of course, with 2014 coming up in Afghanistan next door.
Well, thank you, and we are joined by another guest in Karachi. Irfan Hussain is a regular columnist with The Dawn. He's an author, and we are very happy that he could join us. Irfan, welcome to the show. Can you hear us?
Yes, I hear you fine.
Wonderful, Irfan. So good to have you. We're talking about sectarian violence. We talked a little bit about its background, and we're now talking about why the resurgence when it once subsided. Irfan, you're sitting there in Karachi. You're watching it happening all across Pakistan. Do you see similarities in different parts of the country? Describe the landscape to us. Or do you think it's different groups with different agendas doing it in different parts of the country?
Well, I think we need to remember that Shias have been in the crosshairs for the last 20 years. Individuals have been killed in the cities, especially doctors have been singled out. And in the last 2-3 years, we've seen the Hazaras, who are strictly different from the rest of Pakistanis because they're a Central Asian ethnic group, so they're easily identifiable. So these extreme Sunni groups have no trouble in making out if they're Shias or not, because all Hazaras are Shias. So that's one reason they're so vulnerable. And the other reason is that these groups, like the ones who are targeting the Hazaras in Balochistan, have also been used by the army in targeting Baloch national groups. as you know, there's a nationalist insurgency going on in the province. And the army has been using these groups to go after these people. So many nationalists have been kidnapped and killed. So this gives these anti-Shia groups immunity, in their view.
So you brought us to a very interesting point, and I want all of you to pitch in and tell me what you think. What's the agenda here? Is the agenda pure sectarian hatred, or is it, as Irfan just suggested, a little beyond that? Some groups are motivated because they're pushed to go after other groups, and Shias are in the crossfire. I'll start with you, Dr. Ahmed, and then I'll go to everybody. I want to find out what the agendas are, maybe overlapping, maybe not.
Yeah, this notion of sectarianism actually undermining this ethnic separatist movement in Balochistan, is valid to a certain extent. And even otherwise, whether this attacks against Hazara, with more than 100 killed in the recent one, is it only part of sectarianism, or does it have some kind of a wider, scope? There is also suggestion that this Iran versus Saudi proxy war that has been going on in Pakistan for the past more than 20 years also has some role to play in this case. And even otherwise, if we say that the state or its security agencies are not that serious in tackling this issue, well, this kind of an indifference or insensitivity on the part of state security setup may also match with, say, the concern of the international players such as the United States, which has a rivalry with Iran for the past 30 years now.
Okay, so you're suggesting possibly Saudi Arabia and Iran, their tensions. Dr. Gareth Price, let me come to you. What do you think are the agendas here?
I think, there are different agendas. There is, sectarianism, pure and simple. I mean, I think if you look at Karachi, which had been relatively stable until the last few years, I think there you can link in the fact that, influx of refugees from the tribal areas in particular upsets the ethnic balance. It leads to disputes over controls of resources within Karachi. And then you see a resurgence of violence in Karachi. So there you could add in some, if you like, economic angles to the religious or ethnic hatred.
And Irfan, what do you think are the agendas? We heard the Shia Sunni, the international influence, the Saudi Arabia, Iran. We heard the pure sectarian angle. Are there other possible agendas here?
Well, certainly the proxy war is part of it. But in Karachi, which one of your panelists just mentioned, there is also a turf war over protection money. So there are various criminal gangs. They're all associated with the political parties who formed the coalition. So the police can't really get at them in most cases. And Karachi has become very, very violent over the last few years. Daily there are about 10 or 12 people killed in these turf wars. And the influx of the Taliban into the city has added another dimension to the violence. So yes, there are lots of different agendas to the violence, the sectarian killings. But the fact that there is very little consensus among the political parties, and there's also the civil-military divide on how to tackle it. So there is no overarching national consensus that has been developed to tackle this extremism and this violence.
And Dr. Price, you seem to agree with Irfan, because I see you're nodding.
No, well, I think that's right. And it's also this question about the lack of, in the first instance, there are sort of long-term issues and long-term solutions, but in the short term, there's a law and order problem. And if the police or the military are letting groups act with impunity, or people know that they're not going to be caught, in the first instance, that's where the problem lies, and where, if people thought they were going to be caught, then there would be less ethnic or sectarian violence within Pakistan.
So, Irfan, let me come to you. Why isn't the police cracking down on them, or the government in general? Is it just that they're inept, incompetent, or is it more than, as some people suggest, political affiliations and power from different circles? What is it?
Aisha, let me give you just one example. One of the top leaders of the group that's just boasted about killing all these Hazaras in Quetta he was released on bail by the Supreme Court in 2011, although he was accused of being involved in over 100 sectarian murders. So when you have this sort of attitude from the top judicial bench here, you can see that it filters downwards, because the police think that if they're going to risk their lives to capture some of them, and they're going to be released on bail or for insufficient evidence, then why should they bother? So I'm afraid there is, as I said, no consensus. There are no laws tough enough to...
So, okay, so let me come to you, Dr. Ahmed. Where are these political, sectarian, not political, sectarian groups, violent groups getting their funding?
Well, there's the allegation that a lot of the money comes from the Gulf, from Saudi Arabia, and also they're involved in lots of criminal activities. There are protection rackets being run here. There are the kidnap people for money.
Kidnap
so all kinds of rackets.
All kinds of rackets. But let me go to Dr. Ishtiaq Ahmed in Oxford. Dr. Ahmed, are there other sources of funding? There are allegations. We talked about proxy war in Saudi Arabia and Iran funding Shia and Sunni militant organizations. There have also been allegations of the Pakistan military, either in the past and possibly now involved in funding some of these for proxy wars in the region?
Well, there is no hardcore evidence, but there is suggestion and widespread belief even now that this policy of good terrorist versus bad terrorist actually leads to a situation where the state is not actually winning and is not seriously attempting any major effort to go after the individuals and the groups which orchestrate sectarian violence in Pakistan. There is, in fact, a total breakdown of the criminal justice system in the country. There are laws such as Qisas and Diyat introduced 20 years ago and actually brought into the fore by Ziaul Haq's regime, which, like if you are a victim party, then you are the complainant and you are the witness as well. And state is not initiating any prosecution against these very known criminals, as Irfan pointed out, against Malik Ishaq, who was released on bail, despite the fact that an anti-terrorism court had actually given him death penalty, and he was released on bail.
Dr. Gareth Price, tell me about the funding and the political clout, and what kind of impact is it happening in the region on the regional stability?
Well, I mean, to add to the funding point, I mean, the issue with a lot of these groups is that they also have welfare arms. So they're also providing education, healthcare, after the Kashmir earthquake, disaster relief. So there are good elements to them which attract funding, and then presumably this often can get diverted to the more militant groups. I think if you look at the region as a whole, levels of violence have peaked and troughed in different parts, from Afghanistan through to Indian-controlled Kashmir to Pakistan. I mean, what you seem to have at the moment is a greater emphasis on violence within Pakistan. The situation in Kashmir, for instance, is relatively, well, until the last couple of months, relatively stable. So you have a kind of a wider area in which similar Islamist groups are operating against different enemies. And, clearly over the last couple of months, the Hazara community in Quetta has suffered for being the target of these groups.
Irfan, I want to come to you. How much of this has to do with the number of madrasas in Pakistan and the kind of curriculum that's taught there?
Well, certainly these madrasas...
Irfan, go ahead. We can hear you. Okay. For some reason, we cannot hear Irfan, but let me come to you, Dr. Ahmed, with the same question. The madrasa curriculum and the number of madrasas, the impact, please.
There are tens of thousands of madrasas across Pakistan, and many of them, if not all, preach hatred against minority groups, including Ahmadiyya and Shiites. And since they are very well funded, by charities, which are based in the Gulf countries, particularly Saudi Arabia, and Saudi Arabia behind the scenes also officially supports groups, which are involved in sectarian violence or even otherwise in terrorist militancy in the region, then creates a scenario where madrasa, the very existence of madrasa and the way they have been flourishing over the past a couple of decades contributes to this goring situation. And a situation, which if you go back in the 1980s, there were less attacks. They were geographically limited to, say, a couple of cities in Punjab province. Over time, what we have seen through the 1990s and 2000s and beyond, that there has been a geographical expansion. In 1988, there was first major massacre of the Shias in Gilgit-Baltistan area in the northern areas of Pakistan. Now we have seen in the last year a couple of major attacks taking place in this region. Then you have this violence. It was specifically, as Irfan pointed out, targeting the educated people,
doctors,
say in Karachi.
Lawyers, teachers, professors, they're being targeted.
Much more
much more effective. Dr. Gareth Price, let's come to the madrasa curriculum and how there are different kinds of madrasas. There are Barelvis, there are Devbandis, there are Shia. The curriculum, how much of an impact does it have on the overall situation?
I think when you look at Pakistan's problems, it's not, there are specific problems in madrasas, but there are also sort of broader problems in Pakistan's attitude towards India, let's say. It's very hard to have peace with India in the way that the Pakistan military is told to think of India. So you have attitudes towards minorities, attitudes towards Pakistan's larger neighbour. And in total, I mean, it gives rise to attitudes that are intolerant, if you like. Now, and what you see in Quetta is this in the extreme case. So there are specific problems in madrasas, but then amongst Pakistan's middle class, attitudes are often increasingly hardline towards minorities, towards India and so forth. So I think it goes beyond madrasas.
Irfan, do you agree that it's not just a madrasa problem, it's a systematic attitude problem, or do you think the madrasa curriculum has a huge role in it?
Well, the one point to make here is that the madrasas, they produce young people who graduated but are not trained to do anything. So they are easy to recruit for the extremist groups because they can't get jobs anywhere else. So I think that is something that is not just the content of the madrasas, but they're not qualified then to get jobs in the real world. And this is the problem because these people have no prospects and therefore they're easy pickings for the recruiters.
And Irfan, madrasa reform has been on the horizon for a while, but is anything seriously being done about that?
No, although Musharraf, when he was in power, he promised to reform them and put in place modern curriculum and so on, but he did nothing about that. The point is that there are over 20,000 madrasas, and they're being run by a variety of Islamic groups. The majority of them are Deobandi, which is a very hardline, literalist brand of Islam. And there are others, of course, Barelvi and so on, as you mentioned. But it's these hardline, and many of these are supported by philanthropists from Saudi Arabia and the Gulf, who think they're doing a good thing by helping to pay for poor Muslims to be educated. But the point is that these madrasas then end up producing cannon fodder for the jihad. And there's nothing that this government or the previous government seems to be able to do about it. And as I said earlier, unless there is a consensus across the political spectrum to accept that this is an existential threat and do something about it, I fear nothing is going to change.
Okay, let me come to you, Dr. Gareth Price, about what Irfan said, that unless everybody does it and realizes it's an existential threat, A, is it an existential threat? And B, what are the possible repercussions if nothing is done swiftly?
Well, it would seem to me that there's a growing acceptance that it was an existential threat, and these, the cannon fodder that was just described, when they were fighting against India in Indian-controlled Kashmir, for instance, or when they were fighting with the Taliban in Afghanistan, pre 9/11, they're actually fulfilling Pakistan's foreign policy goals. So that's been the shift in understanding that has to take place, is to understand that when these groups are acting back in Pakistan, that there is a threat to the state. These groups aren't acting in the interests of the state as they might have been previously.
Okay, Dr. Ahmed, I want to come to you. Tell me, what are the possible repercussions of not acting against these groups swiftly?
Well, the repercussions we see on the ground every day in Pakistan, it is precisely because we have not acted, or our state establishment has not taken this issue seriously, that we are confronting this gigantic issue right now. And obviously, given the deep roots of this problem, going back to decades-long failure of state establishment to counter the growth of extremism and its militant ramifications, that we confront this serious challenge today. And only revolutionary step, first of all, not just the society, wider society, which considers it now an existential threat, and the very fact that some of these groups, including the international wing of Lashkar-e-Jhangvi, was involved in some of these spectacular attacks against military installations, including the attack on GHQ back in 2009, should actually convince the military establishment to
do something about it. Now, towards the end of the program, let's talk about possible solutions. Dr. Ishtiyaq Ahmed mentioned revolutionary steps. Dr. Gareth Price, what can be some of those revolutionary steps that need to be taken?
Well, in the long term, there needs to be a reconfiguration of what it means to be Pakistani, that it can't be about being Sunni, it needs to be about being an inclusive Sunni, Shia, even Christians and Hindus, if these groups are going to live happily. Otherwise, this will continue, and so the change. But that's a dramatic change that's been going on for many decades of this sort of gradual Sunniization of the country.
Irfan, you're sitting right there in the middle of everything. What steps do you think need to be taken to end it?
Unless there's some kind of close understanding between the civilian government and the military on the one hand, and the provincial government and the federal governments on the other, we can't expect to evolve a consensus. And also recently there was a Pew Institute opinion poll which found that around half of all Pakistanis consider Shias to be non-Muslims. Now these are the attitudes that have been built up over the years by brainwashing, by constant religiosity being spewed out on the media. And unless these things change, I'm afraid I can't see any solution emerging anytime soon.
Dr. Ishtiyaq Ahmed, the final word is with you. He said that you just heard Irfan say that these attitudes have developed over the decades. How do we change that?
Well, as I said before, there has to be a paradigm shift in how the state establishment views internal sources of insecurity and approaches relationship with the neighboring countries. So Pakistan's future actually lies on greater democratization, peaceful relationship with neighbors, a growth of civilian domination of politics, an evolution that has to begin effectively now. Only then we can visualize, concrete steps being taken.
Well, I apologize for interrupting you. You summed it up very well, but that's all the time we have for today. Before we leave, I want to thank our guest, Dr. Ishtiyaq Ahmed from Oxford University, Dr. Gareth Price from Chatham House, and Irfan Hussain, the columnist at Dawn. Thank you. That's all the time we have for today. Goodbye. Don't forget to leave your comments on our Facebook page. We read them all.